Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted you're here for the September 2005 Putney Debate. I understand it's a slightly smaller audience than normally, but we've experienced some flooding because of the heavy rain today in London, and I understand a number of tube stations are out of action, so I'm sure that accounts for it. I've had an apology from a number of people who sadly can't be here, but also Bruce Nichol will arrive a little bit late, and he apologises for that, but he should be here at about 8:30. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Sean Gabb, who, as you know, is one of the most prolific, if not the most prolific, libertarian, free market conservative writer in Britain. I don't think that Sean needs much introduction. I think most of us know who he is, and he's here tonight to talk about Britain and Islam, which is extremely topical. So, ladies and gentlemen, Sean Gabb.
In the 7th and 8th centuries, European Christian civilization faced two great human scourges. In the east and the south, there was militant Islam. From the north, there were the Northmen, or the Vikings. Of these two great scourges, at the time, the Vikings were considered by far the more dangerous and the more frightening. 1200 years later, we've tended to forget the Vikings. The Vikings are romantic people from the past, with their longships and their horned helmets, which I believe they never actually wore. But you see, we've forgotten the Vikings because they were eventually assimilated into our civilization. To a large extent, modern European civilization stems from the converted Germanic and Viking barbarians. We no longer think of them as the deadly threat to European civilization that 1200 years ago they appeared to be. We now, however, still think of Islam. Islam was a threat 1200 years ago, and we still think of it as a threat. In a sense, it has never gone away. In the first explosion of Islam in the 7th century, they managed within 50 or 60 years to take about 2/3 of the entire Mediterranean coastline. That is, they took about 2/3 of the Roman Empire. They took Syria, they took Egypt, they took North Africa. They did take Spain, but they eventually lost it. But to make up for that loss, they took Anatolia, which is modern Turkey. Now, these regions which the Muslims took from European Christian civilization in the 7th and 8th centuries were once as Christian as France is now. The intellectual and spiritual centre of Christianity until the 7th century were Egypt and Syria. Those areas have been lost to us for 1200 years. And it is possible to see Islam as a continuing aggressive threat to European civilization. That being said, I do not want to make this talk tonight into some neoconservative Islam bashing session. We need to take an historical view of the Islamic expansion and the Islamic occupation of that 2/3 of the Mediterranean coastline. Yes, the Arabs took Syria and Egypt away from Greco-Roman or Byzantine civilization. We need, however, to bear in mind that these two regions had 1,000 years ago been taken by the Greeks. They were conquered by the Arabs, but they had before then been conquered by the Greeks. you could see the Islamic expansion into Syria and Egypt as a Semitic reconquest of areas which had previously been taken by the Greeks and then by the Romans. Now, after the first great explosion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, Islam fell into a long period of decadence. In 717 AD, the Arabs laid siege to Constantinople. They were repulsed with horrifying losses, and during the next 200 years, a revitalized Byzantine Empire forced the Arabs back further and further into Syria, eventually retaking Antioch, and I think briefly even Damascus and Jerusalem. The Arabs took Spain after the year 711. They reached France in 732. They were turned back by Charles Martel, the grandfather of the great Charlemagne. And so in the Central Middle Ages, Islam was at least stationary as far as our civilization is concerned, and in many respects was on the retreat. There was then a further Islamic push during the 11th century after the conversion of the Turks to Islam. They reached deep into Anatolia, or modern Turkey. They took Jerusalem, and they threatened Constantinople, which was the justification for the Great Crusades, in which the Westerners, primarily the French, but also some Italians, Germans, and English, went out east and pushed the Turks far back into Anatolia, taking most of the holy places of Christianity and putting Islam again on the defensive. Ultimately, the Crusades in the East were a failure, unfortunately, because for various reasons the Crusaders stopped attacking Islam and decided to destroy and partition the Byzantine Empire, which destroyed the great institutional barrier that protected Europe for many hundred years from Islam. In the West, the Crusades were a much greater success. The Arabs were pushed out of Spain, or rather, Spain was reconquered from the Islamic world and taken so far permanently back into the Christian world. After the failure of the Crusades, Islamic civilization again fell into a period of decadence. But then, under a revived Turkish Empire in the 13th and 14th centuries, it destroyed what remained of the Byzantine Empire and pushed deep into the Balkans. And then, in the 16th century, it pushed deeper into Europe. The Turks laid siege to Vienna in 1529. I believe it was bad rains which stopped Vienna from falling to the Turks. But although the Turks were pushed back from Vienna, they remained in Hungary. When I go to Slovakia, I quite often visit castles which were built in the 16th and 17th centuries by the Habsburg monarchy as a chain of defences against the Turks, deep in Central Europe, deep in the heart of Christian Europe. You will see fortresses, a whole chain of fortresses built to keep the Turks out. After 1529, the Turks fell into another period of spectacular decline, but then there was a revival in the middle of the 17th century. The Turks rolled further forward. They took Crete from the Venetians in 1668. They again reached the gates of Vienna in 1683. They were repulsed by a pan-European army led by the King of Poland. Then, after the retreat from Vienna, the Turks fell into terminal decadence, and during the next century they were pushed further and further back out of Central Europe, eventually ending in the Balkans. During the 18th century, the British and the French conquered India and many of the Islamic regions in India. During the 19th century, the British and the French conquered many traditionally Islamic parts of the world. Eventually, by 1920, there was no part of the Islamic world not directly or indirectly under European Christian rule, except perhaps Iran. It looked as though the Islamic push had been decisively crushed. But even in the 1920s, even as the British controlled the holy places, even as the French and British empires partitioned what remained of the Ottoman Empire into protectorates and mandates and colonies, you could see the gathering force of another Islamic push. And from the middle of the 20th century, Islam, in a sense, went back on the offensive, and today the talk is all of a clash of civilizations in which European semi-Christian civilization is ranged against a revived and confident Islamic world revolution. Now, in this brief historical outline, I have given absolutely no moral view. There has been a war during the past 1300 years between European Christian civilization and Islamic Arab civilization. I will not say that either side has been right or wrong in that dispute. The only thing that has been important is that whichever side in this dispute has been more powerful at any one time has taken the offensive against the other. That is all that matters as far as history is concerned. History is a record of oppressions by the strong upon the weak, or oppressions of the weak by the strong. When the Muslims have been the stronger, they have been the oppressing force in this dispute. When the Muslims have been the weaker, they have been the oppressed force. There are complaints on both sides. It depends on which particular period you are looking at. They have conquered our regions, we have conquered their regions. We need always to bear that in mind. It is difficult when looking at long historical timescales to talk of anybody who is in the right or in the wrong. It would again be very favourable to the neoconservative position if I were to say that the Muslims had been the aggressors and that in all respects they had been in the wrong. But it's difficult to say that. During the more settled periods of Islamic civilization, they did create what is, by all standards, except our own Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment standards, a great civilization. Islam expanded in the first instance by the sword, but it did not conquer always by the sword. Most Muslims, most Islamic areas of the world, were converted, and they were converted by voluntary persuasion. Islamic civilization at its height was a great civilization. You think of that enormous swathe of the Islamic regions of the world, reaching from Casablanca all the way across the Eurasian landmass to Jakarta, and beyond Jakarta to Manila. And within that swathe of Islamic civilization, there was much high culture, there was much commerce, and there was a peaceful, and by most standards, except our own very best standards, a thoroughly admirable way of life. You think of those cities in the middle of the desert, you think of the minarets, you think of the cry of the imam to prayer 5 times a day. You think of those coffee shops where old men would sit playing draughts and discussing the world. You think of the libraries, of the sciences. You think of the scholars preserving Aristotle and commenting on Aristotle and teaching 13th century European scholars about the Aristotelian traditions of Greek philosophy, which during the Dark Ages we ourselves had largely forgotten. It was not a contemptible civilization, and it is even now not a contemptible civilization. There is a book currently in fashion, I forget by whom, called The Myth of Islamic Tolerance. But I'm afraid Islam historically has been a remarkably tolerant religion. No, Judith, I'm afraid Islam has been tolerant. In the areas conquered by the Muslims, Christians and Jews, for the most part, have been left in peace. The Byzantine authorities in Syria and in Egypt were vicious persecutors of the most incomprehensible heresies. They killed tens of thousands of people and blighted hundreds of thousands of lives, trying to persecute people out of one incomprehensible view of the nature of Christ into another incomprehensible view of the nature of Christ. They bled Egypt and Syria white with taxes. When the Muslims turned up in the 7th century, they stopped the religious persecution. It didn't matter if you were Orthodox or Monophysite or Nestorian or Monothelite or Aphtharsodetic. It didn't matter what view you took of the nature of Christ. The Muslims left you in peace. The Muslims did not actively persecute the Jews. As long as you paid the special taxes imposed on non-Muslims, as long as you comported yourself in a publicly inferior manner, as long as you did not try to convert Muslims to your own faith, you were largely left in peace. Judith, until 1830, a Roman Catholic in this country could not sit in Parliament. A Roman Catholic could not legally serve in the armed forces. According to the criminal law in this country, if somebody converted to Roman Catholicism, he suffered serious criminal and civil penalties, and the person who converted him was subject to the punishment of high treason. When the great historian Edward Gibbon briefly converted to Roman Catholicism, he had to leave Oxford, he had to leave this country for several years. In Ireland, Roman Catholics were not allowed to own horses above a certain value. Roman Catholics were not allowed to inherit in front of their relatives who converted to the Protestant faith. Jews suffered various discriminations. Those Christians who did not belong to the approved Christian denomination suffered various penalties. As late as the 1760s, Protestants in France could be put to death on trumped-up charges. When the Jews were thrown out of Spain in 1492, where did they go but to the Turkish dominions? I will not say that Islamic tolerance was perfect, and tolerance is rather different from acceptance, and non-Muslims have suffered systematic discrimination within the Islamic realms. But for the most part, for very long periods, Christians and Jews and other non-Muslims have enjoyed a much greater degree of toleration than non-Christians, or those people who did not belong to the established faith, have enjoyed in Europe. It is only in the past 200 years that we have enjoyed a greater degree of theoretical and practical religious toleration than most people did or have done, in the Islamic world. As late as during the 19th century, the centre of Greek intellectual and commercial life was not Athens, it was Chios and Smyrna and Constantinople. As late as 1920, a third of the population of Constantinople was Greek Orthodox. A majority of the population of Smyrna was Greek Orthodox. It is only since the failure of the Greek conquest of Western Anatolia and the consequent population transfers that the centre of Greek life has shifted decisively back towards what the Romans called the Achaean Peninsula, or modern Greece, with Athens at its heart. Islam has not historically been a persecuting religion. I'm afraid that is a fact, Julie.
She was an Armenian here.
Oh, yes, of course, there were massacres. There has been massive oppression, yes. But that has been rather more occasional than much Roman Catholic oppression. If you compare the massacre of the Armenians with the Albigensian Crusade, it's difficult to say who has been the greater sinner historically, Julie. We cannot simply write Islam off as a fraudulent religion dominated by a few savages in beards who are simply interested in sending out school children with Semtex waistcoats to blow up coffee bars and buses. Islam is a great and sophisticated civilization. We cannot write it off as anything else. We may, to some degree, be drifting into a war with Islam. But if we are to win such a war, we need to understand the nature of the enemy. A couple of years ago, Caroline Cox and John Marks published a book through Civitas about Islam. Now, I have zero respect for Caroline Cox. Because this talk is being videoed, I will not tell you everything I think about her. Caroline Cox. Caroline Cox used to run the British branch of Christian Solidarity International. Some years ago, for reasons I will not discuss, she stopped running the British branch of Christian Solidarity International and had to set up Christian Solidarity Worldwide. But I really will say no more about that. I have no respect for her as an intellectual. I read the book she wrote with John Marks with open, burning contempt. And I will not say anything more about it, because this is not the time or place to say all that I think about Caroline Cox. It is a caricature of Islam that she gives, an utter caricature. And it is a caricature of Islam that you see portrayed in most Western media. And as I keep on saying, the neoconservative image of Islam is a travesty. It is not a religious version of communism. Communism was rotten through and through. It was at war with reality. It was a murderous, false ideology. Islam is not that. Islam is, in many respects, a perfectly viable alternative model to our own civilization. I believe that Islam is inferior to our own civilization at its best. But if you compare Islamic civilization with virtually any other civilization apart from our own, and of course apart from Greek civilization, because we're all trash compared with the Greeks, but if you compare Islamic civilization with almost any other civilization, it is superior, manifestly superior. And so, what have I to say about Islam and Britain? The problem is not Islamic civilization. I have a great deal of respect for it, even if I do not always like it. The problem that we are now facing is that there are around 3 million Muslims in this country. Now that is a problem. It is a problem which we as libertarians must understand and begin to address. This is more important than the European Union. We face a problem with the European Union, but it's not a serious problem. At some point we can leave, and that's the end of it. Forget tax. The levels of tax collected in this country are criminally high. But we know that we can cut taxes, we can cut regulations, we can do most things. The long-term problem that we face in this country, and that, as I said, we as libertarians must begin to think about, is the presence in our midst of 3 million Muslims or thereabouts, and many other people as well who are not Muslims but who in various ways do not share our ways. Now that is a problem. It is the greatest problem that we face. And so far the British Libertarian movement has not discussed this and has not come up with any solutions to that problem. It is possible, as some libertarians do, to see the problem of these 3 million Muslims and of other ethnic minorities as purely one of an overextended predatory state. I wrote a book a few years ago, which I keep meaning to revise, about how the ruling class in this country has forgotten about the welfare of the working classes, and it has dropped all of the early and middle 20th century excuses for state action, i.e. the advancement of the working classes. It has given up on socialism in any sense that we understand it, and has switched to justify its agencies of extraction and control on the grounds of multiculturalism. We have a number of laws in this country against freedom of speech and freedom of association and freedom of contract, which are justified on the grounds of good relations. We are taught to despise our own past on the grounds of promoting good race relations. This year, a film, in part funded by the taxpayer, has been made which shows the Indian mutiny from the most bigoted anti-British view. The British are shown as villains at best. We have a ruling class which is at war with our own past and is doing this partly on the grounds of pursuing good intercommunal relations in this country. However, we could, perhaps, roll back political correctness in much the same way as we have rolled back socialism. It might be that the problem is one of a ruling class which justifies itself on politically correct grounds. The ethnic minorities, and Muslims in particular, are not the villains in this drama. They are simply being used as an instrument against us. Now that is one way of looking at it, and there is a lot of truth in that. But even if we were to tear down the whole fabric of our multicultural police state, there would still be a serious problem. And the problem is this: our entire way of life, certainly our traditional constitutional framework, is based on the assumption of a reasonably homogeneous population. Let me quote Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore. interviewed earlier this year in Der Spiegel magazine. He was asked by the interviewer, "Why are you not a Democrat?" And Mr. Lee replies, "Why should I be a Democrat? I cannot run my system based on the rules of democracy. I have to amend it to fit my people's needs. In multiracial societies, you don't vote in accordance with your economic interests and social interests. You vote in accordance with race and religion. Supposing I'd run the British system here, Malays would vote for Muslims, Indians would vote for Indians, Chinese would vote for Chinese. I would have a constant clash in my parliament which could not be resolved because the Chinese majority would always overrule them. So I found a formula that changed that, and the formula was authoritarianism." Let me read, perhaps Mr. Lee is not a libertarian pin-up. So let me read to you what John Stuart Mill has said on the same subject. This is from his essay on representative government, published in 1861, chapter 16, on nationality as connected with representative government. He says, "Free institutions are next to impossible in a country made up of different nationalities. Among a people without fellow feeling, especially if they read and speak different languages, the united public opinion necessary to the working of representative government cannot exist. The influences which form opinions and decide political acts are different in the different sections of the country. An altogether different set of leaders have the confidence of one part of the country and of another. The same books, newspapers, pamphlets, speeches do not reach them. One section does not know what opinions or what instigations are circulating in another. The same incidents, the same acts, the same system of government affect them in different ways, and each fears more injury to itself from the other nationalities than from the common arbiter, the state. Their mutual antipathies are generally much stronger than jealousy of the government. That any one of them feels aggrieved by the policy of the common ruler is sufficient to determine another to support that policy. Even if all are aggrieved, none feel that they can rely on the others for fidelity in a joint resistance. The strength of none is sufficient to resist alone, and each may reasonably think that it consults its own advantage most by bidding for the favour of the government against the rest." Now that was written by John Stuart Mill, who is as close to being a perfect libertarian in the English sense as you can get. When you have 10%, a quarter, I don't know what the figures need to be, when you have a large block of people in this country who do not think of themselves as British, how can you run a representative democracy? How can you have a system of trial by jury in a country where people will be inclined to find people of another race guilty on account of their race, or inclined to find people not guilty on account of their race? How can you have a system of democratic representative local government when you have ethnic voting blocks who will vote according to their perceived ethnic interests? What is the point of having elections to Parliament when they are simply occasions for public disorder? And you might as well cut out all of the disorder of voting and simply fill up the Parliament based on the latest set of census returns. How can you maintain a set of democratic representative institutions which developed in a largely homogeneous country, in a country which is no longer homogeneous? Now that is the problem that we face. You can blame the multicultural PC establishment for most of the friction which currently exists between ethnic groups in this country. You can say that if we were to privatise education, there would be none of these disputes over having English children forced to learn Bengali. If we were to privatise healthcare, if we were to privatise most of the functions carried out by local government, there would be none of the increasing ethnic friction that we see in this country, and there is some truth in that. But if we have 3 million Muslims in this country and many other ethnic minorities, how are we to maintain an open, liberal democracy in the sense that we recognise it? You can say in reply to me, don't worry, Sean, these people will assimilate. The same questions were asked by people in the 19th century about the Irish. Indeed, in the 1871 census, the Scottish Census Commissioners wrote an introduction to the returns saying that the large-scale Irish immigration to Scottish cities had raised a set of problems which would be around for many generations to come. And yet the Irish immigration to this country does not seem to have led to a collapse of British democracy. That is true, but it depends on the amount of assimilation. And there is a lot of evidence that assimilation is not taking place. There was, of course, much assimilation, much integration during the first wave of immigration in the 1950s and 60s. These people were coming to a country in which they were an insignificant minority. They had to learn English, and many of them wanted to be British. Indeed, many of them regarded themselves as British because they had been born in British colonies and they regarded our Queen as their Queen. And in many cases, they were all citizens, they were all subjects of the same crown as we were. But we are now in the early 21st century, and there are large ethnic enclaves in this country within which people do not need to speak English, in which they do not need to assimilate to any recognisably British way of life because they can live their own ways within their own communities. I have here a report. From the Daily Telegraph from the 1st of September this year. Asian enclaves in British cities are growing in both their size and isolation and are likely to expand even more as a result of further immigration, according to a study presented yesterday. The enclaves in cities such as Bradford, Leicester and Oldham now compare in scale with some of the African-American enclaves in places such as New York, Chicago and Miami, geographers were told at their annual conference in London. Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups in major cities are more isolated than a decade ago. The study of 16 cities funded by the British Academy, the Learned Society for the Social Sciences, found that London and Bradford were home to the most isolated ethnic communities. Researchers defined an isolated enclave as a place where more than 70% of the population were from the same background. They say that Europeans' assumptions that immigrants would be assimilated into the wider culture with time had not been thought through. And there's a quotation, "Some of these people are just not going to assimilate in the way they were previously expected to do. The danger is the assimilation process is so slow that for many it is just not possible." The isolation of Indian, Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities was likely to create long-term social problems. Now, of course, there are examples of people from the ethnic communities, and I'm not now talking purely about Muslims. There are examples of people from the ethnic communities who have assimilated and are as British as anybody in this room. In many respects, are more British than many people in this room. But there are many people who have not assimilated and will not assimilate it. There are many people in this country who have a purely functional knowledge of English and who know nothing of English history and nothing of English ways. And you might say, well, go and talk to the average English person in the street, go and talk to the average native, and they know nothing of English culture. But the point is, they can know about it, and they do have some residual belief when they look at Canterbury Cathedral or Westminster or at the Foreign Office or at the Victoria Monument outside Buckingham Palace, that these are things they do not completely understand, but they were built by their ancestors, and it's all sort of something to do with their past. You do not have this with many members of the ethnic minorities. They do not know what these things are, they do not know what they mean, and they do not feel that they have any duty to understand what they mean. And now, of course, there is the war on terror. There is a substantial, though numerically very, very small minority within British Islam, and I now talk about Islam again. There is a very small, a numerically insignificant but still substantial presence within British Islam which sees itself as at war with British or Western or European or Christian civilization. Let me quote from a report. I don't have the newspaper article, but I could find it very easily. It was reported on the 17th of July. The uncle of Shahzad Tanweer, one of the 4 London bomb suspects, has defended his nephew's actions as a desperate sacrifice in an interview with the British tabloid newspaper, The News of the World. Now, of course, I don't regard The News of the World as a newspaper of record, but I'm sure I could find this in any of the newspapers of record. He says, apparently, these suicide bombers are desperate people. They're not getting their rights. They can see that their brothers are not getting their rights, so they take extreme action. This lad, his nephew, had made a name for himself in the world. Muslims call it a sacrifice. The Europeans call him a terrorist. Tanweer's uncle laid the blame for the rush hour attacks on London's transport network at the feet of British Prime Minister Tony Blair and US President George W. Bush, warning, there will be more. Citing US policy in Iraq and the Middle East, as well as its treatment of detainees at the Guantanamo Bay base in Cuba, Ahmed told the paper that Western disregard for the rights of Muslims was driving young men to violence. He says, quote, Britain and America are saying that they will defeat terrorism. I am saying that terrorism can be finished in 1 second. Why can't Blair and Bush apologise for the way they have abused the human rights of Muslims? They should apologise, they should stop these injustices. Now, I was bitterly opposed to the war in Iraq. I think that the invasion of Iraq was utterly unjustified. And I think that Tony Blair is a warmonger, an imperialist, and a war criminal. Now, perhaps you don't agree with me, but the point is, I believe that the war with Iraq was wrong because it was not in accord with British interests. These people, whose opinion I share about the war, disagree with the war not because they think it was against British interests, but because it was against the interests of the Islamic Ummah. It was against the interests of their people. Sometime within a month after the 11th of September bombings in New York, I was travelling on an underground train through East London, and I saw 2 young Asian men looking at a newspaper, talking about this, and saying, well, look, they've attacked our people in Palestine. Look what they're doing to our people. I'm not saying that this was right, but they are attacking our people. It's them and us. Yes. Let me say this. I wandered past the Finsbury Mosque the other day, the Finsbury Park Mosque the other day, and there were enormous banners in the English language quoting verses from the Quran, denouncing violence and saying that Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance. And there are many people there are many Muslims in this country who utterly denounce these terrorist bombings. I had dinner a few days ago with a Muslim who said that he was shocked that young men who've been born and brought up in this country, and who'd had all the benefits of liberal democracy and all the benefits of the British way of life, should so treacherously turn against us. Most Muslims do not agree with these terrorist attacks in London, but the problem is some of them do agree with it. And as with Irish communities in the 1970s during the Troubles, these Islamic communities, in Chairman Mao's words, are the water within which the fish swim. They do not agree with the terrorism, but to some extent they agree that there are grievances, and perhaps these young suicide bombers are taking the wrong course of action with regard to these grievances. But there are grievances, and there is them, and there is us. Now, what are we going to do about this? I would like to say, let us tear down the edifice of the multicultural PC police state, and that will improve matters. But will it? If you are to run a multicultural society without massive, systematic, intercommunal violence, you probably need a PC police state. You need to stop large numbers of people from saying what they believe, from saying in public what they're saying in private. If we were to repeal all of the race relations laws, if we were to allow people the same freedom of speech which we enjoyed 40 years ago, would that really contribute to intercommunal relations in this country? I don't know. Now, what are we as libertarians to do about this? Nick Griffin and the British National Party, they have a solution to this problem. Their solution is ethnic cleansing. It is to kick out very large numbers of Muslim and non-white immigrants, and to return this country to a largely homogenous society. And these people, let me say again, are not National Socialists. They're not Nazis who want to stuff people into concentration camps. They're white nationalists. They believe to a surprising degree in the preservation of our historic liberties. There is a very large difference between National Socialism and white nationalism. And the British National Party is increasingly a white nationalist party. They have a solution to the problem, which is to throw out or to buy out the majority of the ethnic minorities. As libertarians, we are not in favour of that. But what else are we to do? Do we believe in maintaining the fabric of a multicultural PC police state? No, we do not. We believe in freedom of speech, freedom of contract, and freedom of association. And so, bearing in mind that assimilation is not taking place, and bearing in mind that continuing immigration and the differential birth rate between the native population and the ethnic minority population is likely to increase the size of these ethnic enclaves, what are we to do? And one last point I'll make. It is easy to say, as many Conservatives have, these people must assimilate. We must impose the cricket test on these people. These people must stop talking about them and us, them and us. They must talk about we British. But, to be honest, why should they? What is the British culture to which we expect these people to assimilate? Is it a high culture? How many British people take their children to museums? How many British children know anything about the glorious civilization of this country? Not that many. What we are saying when we tell Muslims, you must assimilate, you must bring your children up to think of themselves as British, what we're saying is this: you must stop bringing up your children into values of thrift, sobriety and continence. You must encourage your children to get beastly drunk every Friday and Saturday night. You must laugh when they dope themselves silly with various recreational drugs. You must shrug when your daughters get pregnant. And you must rejoice when your children insist on watching programs like Big Brother, in which women masturbate with wine bottles on camera, in the desperate hope of winning £50,000, while a moronised population looks on in approval. I'm afraid before we can expect these people to assimilate, we must give them a model to which they can be happy to assimilate. And I'm afraid we're not doing that. We have a population of 3 million Muslims in this country who do not think of themselves as us, and whom I cannot expect, in the present circumstances of our degraded culture, to think of themselves as us. Now, what are we as libertarians to do about this? We cannot allow continuing immigration, bearing in mind that assimilation is not happening. We cannot throw these people out. We cannot assent to the continued structures of a multicultural police state. And so there is a problem. And what are we saying about this problem? Do we accept that a problem exists? And if we do accept that a problem exists, what possible solutions do we have to it? So that is the end of what I want to say tonight. With malice to none, without saying anything that will bring libertarianism or the Libertarian Alliance into disrepute, I have raised a number of what I believe to be serious problems. You will notice that I have given no answers, no solutions to those problems. What I am looking for tonight is not questions from everybody else in this room, but your own solutions, if indeed you agree with me that there is a problem. Thank you.
Sean, thank you.
Yeah, I thought it was a very enthralling talk. I've got loads of things I'd like to say on it, but I'm going to be so bold as to offer a solution to the problem. I'm a firm believer that libertarianism is a complete solution in and of itself to all social problems. And I think there is a problem here, and I think libertarianism has a solution, and this is what I think it is. What should libertarians do about it? I think libertarians should utterly repudiate all tribalism, absolutely all tribalism. It should be totally and thoroughly intellectually repudiated. And that includes this idea of Britishness and British culture and the idea that there's something homogeneous about Britain, or there should continue to be something that we should try to continue to maintain, some sort of essentially British characteristic within this particular island. I think that should be completely repudiated, as well as the idea of sort of an Islamic community or an Arabian community. The whole notion of tribalism ought to be thoroughly and absolutely intellectually repudiated. I think to some extent that is what's going on, but the option that's been taken so far is an utterly false one. It's multiculturalism, it's PC, it's political correctness, which is an attempt to try and maintain the liberal democratic state, but through sort of various force and manipulation and thought control and ideas to try and sort of bring about this kind of sort of bizarre and self-contradictory idea of tolerance. I think that is absolutely wrong and exacerbates problems, makes things much worse than they need to be, and you are right to say so. What should we advocate instead, after we've repudiated tribalism? I think we should advocate instead an absolutely relentless methodological individualism. Total and absolute methodological individualism. What libertarians should do is aim to have the intellectual hegemony of the world to be one of utterly, totally relentless individualism in every single aspect. And so if we have enclave, it's one that will be tolerating, it will tolerate enclaves of brutal, cruel Sharia law in Bradford, but it will also tolerate areas of mass sexual decadence and things like that. I think you are being when you
You mean Peckham? You mean Peckham?
When you attack things like Big Brother, I think this is just cultural high-handedness attacking British society, and it's sort of if people want to binge drink and shag around and watch Big Brother and masturbate on television with wine bottles, that's all absolutely fine. There's a constituency for that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that at all. I don't see even why it should be disdained on as something to aspire to. It gives people a lot of joy, it gives people a lot of pleasure. I don't think there's any reason why intellectuals ought to mock or attack this at all. Obviously it's not going to appeal to anything. So I think the idea is to try and replace the dominant idea of the world, which is tribalism. I'm not saying it's going to be easy or simple, but I think this is what libertarians ought to advocate. Total repudiation of all tribalism, including this notion of Britishdom. I think the problem arises because it's a problem to maintain a kind of homogeneous liberal democracy, of course, but I'm not interested in homogeneous liberal democracy. I'm interested in total and absolute methodological individualism. That's where happiness lies, in complete freedom of association. The important moral lesson to get across, the important moral principle that can be put in people's heads and which is compatible with almost sort of anything that's not aggressive, is one of respect for individual autonomy. That's not difficult. It's hard to get it across. That's what we should aim for.
Of course, we're all possibly subconsciously very well aware of the fact that if we say anything nasty about Islam, we may find ourselves doing 7 years. But I don't care. I think it would be worthwhile doing 7 years for speaking the truth. And what I'm going to say is, first of all, the nonsense about how well other nations and faiths did under Islam. If you study the history of Spain, you will find out that the Jimmy, as they were known as, first of all, they paid an extremely heavy tax. Secondly, it was made plain to them in every way that they were second-class citizens, bound by every sort of petty restriction, even having to step aside in the road if a Muslim came. And worst of all, because Islam believes in slavery, it's written into the Quran, so of course it's fine, every year, boys of 7 or 8 years old were taken away from their families to serve in the janissaries and also, interestingly, in the civil service in Muslim states. And these boys were taken away and were never seen again. And this, I think, was the hardest thing that these Jimmies had to face. Of course, there was from time to time, there were massacres, and there was a constant state of warfare in some parts of Spain. But otherwise they were fine, otherwise it was a very happy state of affairs, as you said. But what I think is, personally speaking, is the worst feature of Islam, even worse than its licensing of slavery, its total lack of anything whatsoever resembling democracy in any form. The worst thing about it is its treatment of women. Now, I know this treatment does somehow lead to a certain popularity in certain Western places. Among the henpecked and the mum's boys, the thought that women are inferior, it is stated categorically in the Quran. Women are inferior and they have got to be under the power of a male relative from their birth to their death. And even at death they are in the power of a male relative because their husbands are allowed to say whether they can get to paradise or not. And you can't wonder that it's also stated with considerable pleasure by some Muslim theologian that hell is full of women. So I think there is only one possible solution to this problem, and that is to support and uphold in every way those very few, very brave Muslim women who are trying to fight the system. And I think that that is literally the only possibility that we have. Because Islam, let's face it, is fun for men. And I mean, they can have 4 wives and as many slave women as they can get hold of. And they can go into their house knowing that they are superior. They are in charge. They can make the women do whatever they want them to do. And it is laid down in the Quran that if a wife refuses her husband anything, she can be flogged until she consents. That's in the Quran. And so you can see that certain type of man, it's really very nice. But women, well, there is one woman quoted in a remarkable book I recommend to you called Why I'm Not a Muslim, written by a man who lives in America. And he quotes a Pakistani woman saying, it's hell to be a woman in Pakistan. And that is true for any other Muslim state. It is hell to be a woman. If a woman is raped, she has to have 4 male witnesses who actually saw it. Well, you can imagine how often that happens. And if she cannot prove it with 4 male witnesses, she is likely to be flogged again for having tempted the man. And there's only one hope, I think, and that is through the women. We should support Muslim women who are fighting for some sort of rights and freedom in any way that we can. And I think that if that happens, if the women can gain something, some tiny scrap of rights and self-respect, decent treatment, I won't sicken you by describing to you what's called female circumcision. But if you're interested, there is some literature on the subject. And they say there are something like 50 million women who suffer from it today, even in this country. And if these women somehow can be supported and helped, I think that is really the only hope. Because if women get freedom, Islam collapses. And so do most of the Muslims.
Actually, Sean, some of these things were notes I made during your speech. First of all, the irrelevant question occurred to me. If Catholics weren't allowed in armed forces, why were there so many Irishmen in the British Army at the time of the Napoleon Wars? And I can't see the 3 million Muslims in Britain. First I've heard of it being that many. Where do you get it from? Now to get down to the nitty-gritty. On immigration, I am not a libertarian. I believe that we should only admit those who can read, write and speak fluent English, and that libertarian values are Western values. Very simply, these people, well, they are subversive of our values. They don't like to undermine them. Democracy, well, I believe in total free speech of the US First Amendment applying everywhere, but I have reservations about universal suffrage. I essentially believe that people who can't read shouldn't be able to vote either. My solution would be to repeal the Race Relations Act and all these anti-discrimination laws, abolish the industry they've thrown up, end multiculturalism, all official documents to be in English, these vile customs like forced marriages, female sex in ritual slaughter, those commitments should be deported, and we should, I'm really curious about Muslim women, we should stop being so defeatist and apologetic, say that our way of life is better. We should say that quite unequivocally. You're offended, so be what? And finally, when it comes to Big Brother, 300 years ago they went to gulp at lunatics in Bedlam. Now we have Big Brother reality TV. I suppose you might call that progress.
Okay.
On this question of women, it's interesting. An American anthropologist I know who actually went so far as to go and live among the people he was studying, which was the American Indians, and I will not call them Native Americans because anyone born in America is a Native American.
Hear, hear.
And cowboys and Native Americans just won't do. So they are Indians to me. And he went and he lived among them and studied them at grassroots level. And he said one of the main reasons for the subjugation of the Indians was that squaws wanted to marry white men. Because if they did, they'd be the only wife. They wouldn't have to drown their girl babies. They wouldn't face being turned out into the desert to die of starvation when they were old. And when the brave rode ahead on his war horse, they wouldn't have to tramp behind carrying the babies and the luggage. And they would sit beside their husbands on the seat of the buggy. And of course there was such an overwhelming number of men to women in the West the time, they were glad to marry anybody. And probably after being used to American women, they were awfully glad to have squaws who'd been trained to be subject to their men. And so it was something that suited all people. So you see, silly as it may seem to you, the approach to women is probably not such a bad idea.
Let me respond to some of the comments from the audience, and I'll do so in a vaguely logical order. Let me begin with Paul Coulomb. Now, of course, everything he said I agree with. It is orthodox, straightforward libertarianism. Yes, I do believe in a world in which people are free to do as they please, and in which people are considered as individuals, and not as members of any self-defined ethnic, religious or other group. Yes. On the subject of British culture, I do believe that British culture, as it seems at the moment, is decadent and corrupt. If women want to masturbate with wine bottles on live television, of course they must have the right to do that, and I will go into any radio and television studio in this country and defend their right to do it. But at the same time, I do think it is unseemly and degrading. I have no objection to pornography. I have no cultural objection to pornography. But I do believe that there are public boundaries, and there is a time and a place to behave in this manner. And for somebody to behave in such a manifestly unseemly and degraded manner on live prime-time television watched by millions of people is not, I think, a sign of cultural health. Let me now turn to the much more radical objections that Judith has made to my presentation. And what I would say to Judith is that you must compare like with like. There is no point, I think, in comparing Islam as it has existed with Western liberal democracy as it existed from the middle of the 19th to the late 20th centuries. Yes, Islam has accepted slavery. So historically has Christianity. Some years ago, I read my way through the complete letters of Pope Gregory the Great, who died, I think, in the year 604. He was one of the great medieval popes, and in his day, the Church owned hundreds of thousands of slaves. In one of his letters, Gregory accepts that a church slave may buy his freedom from the church by handing over a legacy that he has received. There was no objection by the Christian churches in late Roman or early medieval times to slavery, and there has, until fairly recently, been no specifically Christian objection to slavery. And so, yes, Islam has accepted slavery, but I'm afraid so has Christianity. As far as toleration is concerned, I stand by the points I made earlier. Historically, Islam has been at least as tolerant of Christianity, and in many cases more so. Do you know, Judith, why there are so many Protestants in Hungary, but so few in Slovakia? The reason is because during the Protestant Reformation, Slovakia was part of the Habsburg dominions, in which Protestantism was regarded as a damnable heresy and was persecuted, whereas Hungary was under Turkish control, and the Turks had no objection which heresy the Christians adopted. Protestantism was fully tolerated in Turkish Hungary, and in the late 17th century, when the Habsburgs rolled back the Turks from Central Europe, the Habsburgs themselves had in practice accepted religious toleration as a tactic, if not as an overall strategy. The Protestant Reformation was allowed to flourish in Hungary because of Islamic tolerance. In Slovakia, it was not allowed to flourish. As far as women are concerned, yes, women are inferior in Islam, but I'm afraid until quite recently, women were regarded as inferior in European... One moment, Judith, we're on tape. Until fairly recently, women were regarded as inferior in our own civilization. Until 1892, in this country, married women were not allowed to own their own property, or rather 1883, and then in 1892. Until fairly recently, until about a century ago, women were not allowed to speak in court. They had to speak through their husbands. Women were only given the vote in this country in 1918, and they were given the vote on the same basis as men in 1928. Now yes, in Islam, as it is generally regarded, women are regarded as unequal. You need to bear in mind, however, that there are many different interpretations of Islam. And I have been fortunate enough to talk with Hassan al-Turabi. According to the Western media, he is the Pope of terrorism, the godfather of the Sudanese fundamentalist Islamic revolution. Now, Hassan al-Turabi is an Islamic scholar of remarkable sophistication who gathers astonishing respect throughout the Islamic world. And I have read my way through a long interview with him in French, in which he is fluent. I have also spoken to Hassan al-Turabi, and I wrote the introduction to the English translation of his very important text, The Position of Women in Islam, in which he reconsiders a number of key Islamic texts and asserts that as far as pure Islam is concerned, or rather according to his conception of Islam, women have equal civil and political rights to men. Now, there are 1,000 million Muslims in this world, Judith. There are some Muslims who regard women as the sexual playthings of men, and there are some Muslims who regard women as human beings with the same inalienable rights as men. And some of these Muslims are Islamic scholars of international repute, and Hassan al-Turabi as one. I have also been fortunate enough to have had dinner and several long conversations with the wife of Hassan al-Turabi, who is, by the way, the granddaughter of the Mahdi. And she gave me a very nice coffee pot a number of years ago, which has a position of importance among the ornaments in my house. She is a remarkably forceful woman. She quite obviously wears the trousers in her relationship with her husband, and she is the head of the Sudanese feminist movement. And she runs a number of campaigns against female circumcision, which she regards as an un-Islamic practice, which has simply been assimilated from pre-Islamic cultures. There is nothing in the Quran or in the sayings of the Prophet which require female circumcision. Female circumcision does not exist in Syria or Saudi Arabia or in Iran, or in many other Islamic countries. It is local to Egypt, to Sudan, and a number of other countries, and it is a pre-Islamic custom which has been assimilated to local Islam, and she regards it as an un-Islamic custom. Yes, women are regarded by most Muslims as institutionally inferior to men. But, as I said, you must compare like with like. Until very recently, even in England, which is the most advanced liberal civilization which has ever existed, women have been regarded as inferior. It was only when Nigel Lawson was Chancellor of the Exchequer that the anomaly of allowing men to take over their wives' tax allowance was ended. It is only perhaps in the last 20 years in this country that women have had exactly the same legal rights as men. Let me turn to Mark Taha's points. He asked me why, if Catholics were so persecuted in the past, were so many Catholic Irish allowed to join the British Army. There are two answers to that. Most of these Catholic soldiers were privates, they were not officers. The second answer to his point is that there was a widespread connivance by the authorities to allow Irish Catholics to take commissions illegally in the British Army. There were many Catholics in Nelson's Navy. They kept rather quiet if they were officers. They were allowed to break the law so long as they did not bring it to public notice, in much the same way as homosexuals have always been quietly tolerated in the armed forces, so long as they did not bring their taste or their nature to public attention. Mark also talks about liberal values. Yes, of course, I believe that Western liberal democracy, or rather, let's not talk in vague abstractions, I believe that the English way is the best. I believe that English civilization, of which liberal democracy is a subset, is the best civilization that has ever existed, apart perhaps from the Greeks, and that all human beings would benefit from learning from our civilization. Of course I believe that. I am not a cultural relativist. I believe that my country has shown people how to live, and I believe that the world would be a much better place if everybody was English. Not American, certainly not American, but English. Yes, I believe that my culture is the best, but it does not mean that I dismiss the positive aspects of other cultures. And Marx says he would abolish the whole structure of race relations in this country. Yes, of course we should. Of course we should allow people to say what they think. Of course we should allow people to say things like blacks are inferior, or the Holocaust never happened. We should allow people to put advertisements in newspapers saying room to rent, white people only, or black people only. We should allow people to have their traditional rights to freedom of speech, to freedom of contract, and freedom of association. I agree with Mark and Paul and with everybody else in this room on those points. Of course, I am a libertarian. I believe in those things. The question I have is, how can we allow freedom of speech in a country which is becoming so balkanized that the only way to maintain any kind of peace is by shutting people up, is by stopping people from discussing certain issues which might lead to public disorder? That is a problem. Judith made an interesting point about the Red Indians. Yes. A very good friend of mine whose name I won't mention, not because he would be upset by it, but because I choose not to mention his name, a very good libertarian comrade of ours in America is partly Red Indian. And that is doubtless because one of his ancestors was an Indian squaw who thought that she would get a better man by choosing a white. And that brings us on to the subject of assimilation. Yes, I would dearly love to see a day when every Muslim in this country would stand up proudly and wrap himself in the Union Jack, as most Jews do, and say, I am a British citizen of the Muslim faith. And what I would also say is that some years ago, when England was doing rather well in a football championship, I really know nothing about sport, prayers were said in many British mosques for the success of the English football team. Now, I don't think there were many Anglican services in which the local vicar was saying, "Oh Lord, look gracefully on the progress of our gallant footballers and give them victory in this tournament." Many Muslims are more patriotic than the native English, and I would dearly love to look forward to a day when the concept of Britishness or of Englishness has expanded to the point where, just as today, you can be an English Catholic or an English Anglican, or an English Methodist, and be as English can be. Or just as you can be a Jewish Englishman and be as English can be to talk of absent friends, you can also be an English Muslim. I would really love that to come about. My fear is that it won't. My fear is that we have a problem. And although I am impressed by the answers given to the questions I raised, and although I respect everybody who has made a contribution to this debate, I still do not think that we have really addressed the problem that we face, beside which the problems of tax and regulation and even of Europe pale into insignificance. And that's all I have to say. Thank you.
I thought the talk was extremely good. I thought it was Sean being very Sean. I thought it was quite a pessimistic talk, but Sean does pessimism very well. I thought there were some contradictions in it, and there were some elements that, because they were contradictory, I would like, if it's possible, to have them filled out at some point, whether now or in writing. But here are my reactions. We talked about the incompatibility of a multicultural society with democracy. I think the word multicultural can mean different things to different people. If it means that there are literally different isolated cultures in a liberal democracy, then yes, I can accept that completely separate and isolated cultures will not necessarily underpin a democracy. They might indeed tear it apart. But to other people, the word multicultural means that people bring to a geographic area lots of different tribal traditions, and they trade them and they respect each other's traditions. For example, I've got some Catholic friends in New York who last year said to me, "Happy Hanukkah." They knew I wasn't Jewish, but that's just such an important, vibrant part of New York that it's something they've all come to celebrate and respect, and part of the culture. I have many Jewish friends in London, Stephen Pollard's one of them, whose family celebrate quite happily Christmas. If we mean by multiculturalism people getting on in tolerance and respect and sharing and mutating over the generations, exchanging ideas and cultures and enriching their lives, then I'm all in favour of it. I think today, in 2005, I'm not generally pessimistic about the future. I think there's an awful lot more assimilation and integration going on. I think that one of the great threats to particularly elders in the Muslim community is the fact that their children and grandchildren are marrying out, that there is an increasingly liberal wing. No doubt there are some extremist and fringe elements, and we've seen it with the bombings recently, but overall I see a lot more assimilation, a lot more mixing of cultures in the positive sense than I think the speaker was acknowledging. That's a question of interpretation, but time will tell. There were some contradictions, I felt, and it'd be interesting to come back to these, because on these I don't come down one side or the other. They're simply huge question marks over my head. On the one moment we were talking about icons in our civilization, the Albert Memorial, the Palace of Westminster, and these supposedly resonating with a sense of Britishness. Whatever that was, again, there was no real attempt at codifying it. But then on the other hand, we were denigrating a culture by simply writing off the mass of people as if they were all beer-swilling drunkards. I'm suspecting that perhaps neither is true, that an awful lot of people aren't moved, particularly by the Albert Memorial. They see it as art, they study it, they see it in a historical context. There's a rather good programme about it on the Open University, which I've watched twice. It's all very interesting. But I'm not sure a vast number of people are moved by it. On the other hand, I think I know a pretty diverse range of people. I've been a student myself. I've done a little bit of beer swilling in my time. Yes, there is beer swilling in city centres. I don't think Portsmouth in the 19th century on a Saturday night would have been the most uplifting of experiences down by the quayside, but in a sense it's sort of business as usual. And but I am optimistic. I think of Voltaire's essay on London. People of different traditions, different tribes mixing together in commerce. And then I think of America. I think of the most powerful, the most successful in many ways, democracy. If anything, America was built on an ideology of multiculturalism, as I've described it, in the positive sense. And I have many, many friends in America, and I have them, I'm pleased to say, of different racial and cultural backgrounds. And they do all seem to enrich each other's lives, and through the generations they have come to share some core values. Now, maybe, and this is now to side with the speaker, maybe the Muslim world is completely different, and that there is a subset of Muslim that will never assimilate, and maybe there are problems there. But this is the sort of cultural terrain in which I have question marks over the debate. As a libertarian, so far, I tend to side with Paul's comments about methodological individualism, but in no way am I denying the potential threat, which is the threat that Sean might be right, and that there might be a subset of Muslim who is fundamentally dangerous, and that this time round we might also, and I think this is very important, be entering an era where individuals can access weaponry and technologies which do damage to a huge area and to a vast number of people. If we're moving in the 21st or indeed into the 22nd century into an era where technologies develop that mean that, for example, a dirty bomb in the hands of 2 or 3 people could literally render the financial heart of the City of London null and void for many decades, if not more, then that, I think, calls into question what we mean by individual freedom and individual liberty. But that wouldn't just relate to Muslims. It could relate to the mentally ill. It could relate to all kinds of people. It could even, dare I say it, relate to the people who are moved by the Palace of Westminster, indeed the Albert Memorial. So ultimately, to sum up, I'm positive. I'm positive about the future of race relations in Britain, although I have a question mark, and Sean's talk has certainly been a pause for thought. But more importantly, I wonder about the technological era that's before us, where individuals might be able to access weaponry that is undreamt of in human history. And in that world, our traditional notions of individual freedom, the individual's right to do horrific things that can impact on our entire society and economy, that to me almost transcends the problems that have been mapped out tonight. I think they go further beyond that. I've been no doubt incoherent myself, but that's all part of this evening and part of the fun. So thank you.